Hello, and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. It's Friday the 24th of December, and this is Scotland at 7. I'm Andrew Wilson, and welcome to our studios in Glasgow. I'm lucky enough today to be joined by a regular guest and contributor, the former Deputy Presiding Officer in our Parliament and former MSP, Linda Fabiani. Linda, good evening, how are you?
Good evening, I'm absolutely grand.
Well, thank you for joining us this evening. We're very
Pleasure.
grateful to you, and it's lovely to see you. What we're going to do this evening, we'll have a slightly different programme for you tonight, and what we'll do is that Linda and I are going to discuss the top stories and the headlines from the news for the first half of 2021. So from January through to June, we're going to look at the top stories for each month and review them from the perspective that we now have at the end of the year. We should dive straight into that, Linda, if we can. What we'll do first, I think probably the first story that we should look at, the year really began with a bang, especially in American politics, with the run-up to the inauguration of President Biden, which was preceded by the events on the 6th of January of the attempted coup, the insurrection, the riot that unfolded in the streets of Washington and through the People's Palace of Democracy in Washington. So now that we see the legal processes have begun with a number of people who were intimately involved being subpoenaed by Congress and being hauled before the Congress to give evidence, and a number who are saying that they will refuse to respond to those subpoenas, and as a result they are now finding themselves in contempt of Congress. From the perspective that we have now, what's your view about the way in which events, firstly, the way in which events unfolded and the implications, what happened on the 6th of January?
It was stunning. It was what a start to the year for us to watch it, in Scotland and Europe. But for America, United States of America, that so-called bastion of democracy, I remember just being quite stunned at it. The first I saw of any of it was in fact on social media, and it was a picture of that very strange chap all dressed up like something.
The shaman, yes.
Shaman, that was, well, it didn't look like a shaman to me, but that's what he purported to be. Yes. I just thought he looked mad myself. And it was just absolutely stunning, and I didn't quite believe it. And then, someone said to me about this happening and tuned in to watch it properly. And it was absolutely horrifying. For all, I'm very quick to criticise the USA for many things that they do in their politics and in their human rights record and general things about democracy, but that was still a shock. And it's interesting to look at what's happening now with these subpoenas and everything else. We've got to look behind that, though, at what allowed this to happen. And America, I keep saying America, I should say the United States of America, because it's not the whole of the Americas. The United States of America does hold itself up as a leader in the world. And yes, we do tend to look at that nation as the most powerful nation in the world. And where it leads, so many others follow. And I find that really worrying. And looking behind it all, this didn't just happen overnight. This is something that has built up. Yep. And of course, former President Trump was the epitome of that in his attitudes. Mm-hmm. But he's not alone in the world. Mm-hmm. And I think there is a real issue around what we always comfortably looked at as democracies becoming a bit more intolerant of an awful lot of things. And I think we see it in the United Kingdom as well. Mm-hmm. Some of the horrendous policies that are coming through from the UK government. So this is a global issue. So you've got democracies that we always comfortably and complacently thought of as democracies that are starting to become a wee bit different. But you've also got those places where we always felt they were a bit right-wing and started to come towards what we believe is democracy, who seem to be going back the way.
Yes.
And I think there's a real concern globally. I know United Nations has got specific tasks and specific remits, but there must be some kind of global discussion about what's happening here. And I think as we go through even the first 6 months of the year as we will, we'll see more pointing towards the kind of thing I'm talking about. I think it's very, very worrying indeed, especially when I read, hear, watch that former President Trump maintains a big following in the United States of America.
Absolutely.
And there is talk of a return of Trump. And even if it's not a return of Trump the man, the idea of a return of Trumpism is horrifying as well.
Yes, and of course with his family, with the reputation for running both the Trump organisation, I suppose you should call it, but also his presidency very much as a family business. You do wonder if even if it isn't Donald J, if it is another of the clan who will be a...
Or even another of those who believes the same as... Or does he believe it? Or is it just power? Another of his cohorts, even if not directly related, would be worrying. I mean, it was a wonderful moment when Joe Biden and Kamala Harris took over and the inauguration and things. I was a bit concerned. I hope I'm not accused of being ageist, but having just passed a significant birthday myself, I do know that you slow down and you don't have as much energy, and things do change. But I was still really pleased that what I saw as a fairly decent guy was taken over.
Yes.
And I thought it was a wonderful message of Kamala Harris being there too. I've not heard much of her, though. That bothers me.
It's interesting. That struck me this week. She was interviewed on the. She gave an interview last night
Oh,
on
right, I
the
didn't
BBC.
see that.
But it struck the same point struck me that we haven't heard a great deal of her, at least in terms of the reporting we see here. But yes, I like you was encouraged, I think it's fair to say, to see her being interviewed and to hear her speaking. One other thing I was going to ask you about this topic was just thinking, in a sense, putting yourself into the shoes of other lawmakers. We saw the invasion of the Capitol building and the response of the security services and the response of the lawmakers and their staff in what must have been very alarming circumstances. What can you imagine it would have been like in our own parliament if that kind of event, if those events had unfolded?
It just seems so surreal to even think that could happen. I mean, in the 21 years that I was there were a couple of protests that got past security. There was a couple of protests by elected members themselves, but nothing that was seriously frightening, and I think that's a big difference. We had people stand up in the gallery of the chamber and, I was going to say rip their shirts off, but to show their T-shirts. I hasten to add. That was a protest that they got away with. That was fine. We had, I'm not going to say who I think it was in case I've got it wrong, but we did have the trying to glue themselves to seats and things like that, and that was thwarted. But there has been no time in our parliament where I, and I presume any other elected member, felt frightened. But if you had people rampaging in the way they did, and especially somewhere like the US where guns are 10 a penny, that would be seriously scary. And one of the things we pride ourselves on in Scotland and in our democracy, of a sort, and in our parliament is the accessibility and openness.
Yes,
Pre-COVID,
exactly.
I hasten to add, because that has big differences. And I remember I was on the corporate body at the time that we had to put the extra security bollards and things around the building. And it broke our hearts, actually, but you cannot go against good sound advice from those that are at the top of security and those who have all the information. And it was very, very sad. And I would hate to think that we had to do even more than that. But, it's not just United States of America. I mean, I remember being in Ottawa and seeing the spot where someone had broken into the Canadian Parliament. Look what's happened so sadly, what's happened at Westminster over the years.
Yes.
Stormont. I remember hearing the story of Stormont being stormed as well. So I don't know how we would have reacted. It's very, very difficult. So I suppose the downside of having very good security is that you stop that kind of thing happening.
Yes.
But isn't it really sad that folk can't just
Yes,
wander in?
yes, the
Yeah.
respect issues and the
Yeah.
absolutely. No, absolutely right. Thanks, Linda. The only other thing we were going to talk about for January was that if we can cast our minds back, and it does feel particularly difficult to cast our minds back this
Yeah.
year. But in January, the alpha what became known as the alpha variant was was recognised in Kent. I think now we know that it was actually in circulation back as far back as September, but it was late December, early January of this year when it started to appear. At the same time, the vaccine rollout really commenced, and so the vaccination the vaccination programs as they have evolved it will be something that we will come back to in the conversations with the news from other months, but it certainly casting your mind back to almost 12 months now. Can you remember what your thoughts were as we started this the process of rolling out the vaccination program at the same time as a new variant was identified?
Yeah. Well, for me, I think it was. I remember when it came to, oh, it's not over yet, there's another variant. And it felt almost like a bit of a blip, that we were still on the road to recovery and everything was going to be all right, but we'd had a wee blip.
Yes.
That's my naivety and my lack of scientific knowledge, because I understand this is normal with any kind of virus like this, and this is a particularly serious one. But I would never have thought that here we are almost a year later, faced with another dangerous variant, and thinking that's almost 2 years. And, like you said, it's hard to remember. I think that the time in that 2 years all is sort of merged into one.
Absolutely.
And it's hard to remember what happened when.
Yes.
It's very, very strange. As far as the vaccination programme's concerned, we've done that rather well.
Absolutely.
We get all this snash from so many trashy newspapers and some commentators who ought to know better. We get it from some elected members who ought to know better, and you would think it was an absolute disaster.
Yep.
We are doing very, very well. The last time I looked, we were ahead of anywhere else in the UK on many aspects of dealing with this pandemic.
Yes.
And Wales, I have to say, Wales is doing very well, as are we, with the booster injections.
Yes.
So I think we're doing rather well. And I think it is that thing that Nicola Sturgeon said right at the start, which was, we've got a vaccine and it's like a horse race. And I keep hearing about Omicron, not being as bad as everybody says, but here, hold on a minute. We're now looking at Omicron in the context of the number of vaccinations and boosters that have been given.
Yes.
It's still infecting people. And from what I've read, those that are worst affected by a long margin are those that have not been vaccinated.
Yes, absolutely.
So the vaccination programme is working. There may be another couple of variants along the way, but I think we're on the home straight now. We've got to be. And as so many others have said, perhaps it's something that we are going to have to live with in terms of vaccinations, the same way as we do with the flu vax. And I know it's gone back a long way, but a story of my grandmother's when I was a bairn always was in my mind. She had the Spanish flu, back in the day. And she would tell the story of, they lived in Kinnan Park, she would tell the story of all the neighbours clubbing together to get a penny so the doctor could come and see her.
Yes, absolutely.
And, my goodness, how much more fortunate are we, for all our moans and groans, and we all have moans and groans, that we do have a National Health Service that is being protected by our government in terms of public ownership. And we have these wonderful health professionals, scientists, doctors that are coming up with all these vaccines. We'll beat it.
We will. What we should do also now is we should move on to February.
Have we got time to move on to February?
Well, we'll try, and we'll see how we do. The first event that really in February came in with a bang in another part of the world, with the military in Myanmar seeking to overthrow the elected president and overthrow the electoral system in Myanmar. We know that Aung San Suu Kyi is now being tried by the generals. And of course there are objections that there's no possibility that those trials can be in any way fair or reasonable. But I was going to talk to you a little bit about the broader issues arising from that latest coup in that country, and really to again from your perspective as a former lawmaker, the issues of stability or instability that the repeated coups in Myanmar and the repeated seizing of power by the military, the challenges that must bring for the people there.
I can't begin to imagine how that must be. I mean, that's people who must just live their lives in fear. And, right throughout that region, Southeast Asia, it's an area I do know a wee bit about. There are big human rights abuses going on all the time. Indonesia, for example, still occupies West Papua without a proper democratic referendum. And you do have people who live generally aware that they have to be quite careful about certain things they do. But even in that context and in that region, Myanmar is way up there. But Myanmar and North Korea, further up, absolutely brutal regimes. And, you look at that whole issue about, China, we all know about, there are issues in China, but China would say that they look at collective human rights as opposed to individual human rights, and there's a difference.
Yes.
The West doesn't understand it. Myanmar looks at no human rights whatsoever.
Yeah.
It's an absolute power thing. And, I mean, Aung San Suu Kyi, what that woman has been through in her life. Now, I know there's issues about how people feel she dealt with Rohingya people and things. We don't have time to discuss all that and reach our own conclusions on it. But that woman has been a democracy fighter in terms of her own nation for many, many years.
Absolutely.
She was imprisoned previously under house arrest for a long time, kept away from her family. Her husband was in England, in fact, all these years. And here it is again. She democratically won an election. But that doesn't matter. There's no democracy in Myanmar.
Yes.
And for the ordinary people, they must be so battened down. You don't even hear of protests or anything. Like all across Eastern Europe in the day, we had protests.
Yes.
In Timor, we had protests. We've still got protests in West Papua. You never hear of anything really in Myanmar. You get an odd wee blip.
Yes, yes.
And you think, how has that been suppressed? And I suspect it's been suppressed in the most brutal of terms.
Well, absolutely. We know that our friends from the local CNN affiliate who were covering the events in Myanmar, I think all of their journalists were jailed in very short order. So yes, the issues of openness and as you say, we know levels of anxiety in our society have been high as a result of COVID, but in comparison to the levels of anxiety and, as you quite rightly put it, fear in the lives of the people of Myanmar under a military regime.
Do you know, I've read a few autobiographies and things of those who escaped North Korea.
Yes.
And it's, some of the things they've said, it's not even like about living in fear, because you get beyond the fear and it's just an acceptance of this is the way things are. So you just keep your head down.
Yes, exactly.
Aye, must be awful.
Now, the other events in February, I think it's fair to say, bring us back to COVID, unsurprisingly, because at the beginning of the month, it was announced by our First Minister that the schools would begin to reopen at the end of the month, and that did happen. And it was also announced by the First Minister the beginning of the shape of the plans for the reopening of businesses and the unlocking of our society, which was planned to take place, and which did take place, but was in late February, was being planned to take place in late April. So do you think were our minds turning to the future a little bit? Did that message get through?
I think we thought it was the start of the end. It was all going to be over.
Yes.
Because there was all the hurt and the fuss and everything last year round about Christmas, if you remember, Andrew. And that just seemed for so many people like the worst thing that could be. You're kept away from your family and everything. And then things started to get better in February. And it started to get better through summer. I mean, as I say, I can't remember 2020 from 2019 or anything anymore. It's also weird.
Yes.
But I do think I was out and about in the summer, you know, meeting friends in Edinburgh and things like that. In fact, I was. I mean, after I retired, I went away a couple of trips.
Yes.
And then it all just stopped, and you start to say, well, I'm not doing that anymore. I remember the last one I went was to York with a couple of fellow retirees who have been christened the Golden Girls. And the Golden Girls went to York and we had a wonderful time. But that was the point where people were starting to say, wait a minute, this isn't over. We're starting to hear about other things. And it all became quite a bit worrying. So although prior to that restrictions were still in place, there was the feeling we were getting out of it. And it's almost like, I hope by February next year, we'll be feeling that way genuinely again.
Yes, yes.
Because the success of the vaccine programme and the boosters.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah. Thank you, Linda. What we should do, we should crack on. We should keep the calendar spinning and keep it moving in front of us. And we'll move into March now, and I think possibly the two major events in March. But firstly, on the 3rd of March in London, the young lady Sarah Everard's body was discovered. On the 9th of March, her now convicted murderer was arrested. And then, of course, on the Saturday night, the 13th of March, there was a protest marking her murder and the events surrounding her murder. And that protest itself caused a great deal of concern and unhappiness whilst in the midst of a pandemic, the manner in which it was policed by the Metropolitan Police. And so, do you think? Now that's 9 months since those events, and it's a few months since Wayne Couzens, her murderer, was convicted and sent to jail for the rest of his life. What are your reflections in terms of the events the events we've seen with regard to the treatment of women and the concern with regard to the way in which our society continues to behave, which were highlighted by the events surrounding her murder?
Yeah, as you say, there's two very clear issues there. First of all, the horror of a serving police officer,
yes,
behaving that way, just awful. Poor lassie. I mean, I have to say, when I saw the protest, I totally understood the protest. I may have been there myself had I been London based.
Yes.
And I saw some of the policing around it. It was concerning. What's even more concerning is some of the stuff that's come out from the Met.
Yes.
Beyond that. Now, I remembered being in here, and it was Maggie who was chatting with me about this sort of stuff, and she was all for sacking straight away the head of the Met.
Yes.
What's her name?
Dame Cressida Dick.
And I was a wee bit more reluctant, saying, oh, like, let's just wait. And she's going, no, she deserves to go. I'll tell you what, Maggie was absolutely right. Because what's come out since, you know, the WhatsApp groups among serving policemen, the way they've dealt with other people, there seems to be a real disparaging way of dealing with sex crimes.
Yes, yes.
And that has affected women for decades. You know, I'm talking about what's affected women all through time, but modern society, it's affected women for decades. I'm not actually convinced it's got that much better. I think the theory's great. I'm not convinced the practice is great. So, yes, I think Cressida Dick now deserves to get the boot. I don't know who'd take her place. But they always seem to promote from within, and they've had a few right dumplings, as far as I can see, that just keep the status quo all the time. I think the Met have got a real problem. I mean, there was that latest stuff, that mass murderer of young men. And, you know, the families feel quite clearly there was a bias against them because of their sexual orientation. Haven't read. I know that the inquiry said there wasn't, but I'm not convinced about that either. And so I think there's a real attitude problem in the Met. I think there's a real attitude problem against women generally. And we have to be very careful with our own police force, Police Scotland. Again, they say some great stuff. Their policies are all very good, but as an elected member, I sometimes had constituency cases where I was not convinced that things had been properly dealt with.
Yes.
Stalking
is
a particular thing. I mean, I had a few cases where young women seem to me to be quite clearly being afraid and not being taken terribly seriously. A lot in social media,
Yeah.
you know, and what we get back is, well, there's not a lot you can do about that. And, well, you know, actually
Not good enough.
there is. So because of COVID, we haven't had the protests that I think would have been ongoing following the Sarah Everard murder and protests.
Yes.
So I know that some of my colleagues, both male and female, in the Scottish Parliament feel very strongly about this. And in fact, I think that perhaps the committee is looking at stuff like that just now.
Good.
And we had the new lot. I'm still saying we. I'm not quite there yet. I read that the Lord Advocate, the new Lord Advocate, had been at committee and was talking about sex crimes in particular in relation to the reform of the judiciary system.
Yes.
Juries and not proven and all this kind of thing.
Yes.
So things are ongoing, and I know there's people feel very strongly about it.
But there's lots to do. Absolutely right. And of course the other event which dominated the politics in Scotland during March was on the 23rd of March. We had the publication in the Parliament of the final report from the committee that you were able to that you were charged with chairing
for my sins.
And so the report of the Committee on the Scottish Government Handling of Harassment Complaints, the committee published its report its first report on the 23rd of March. Now again, we have a little bit of a perspective. We have the benefit of hindsight now, a little bit of a few months. And so, what are your and it's certainly perhaps understandably, but not necessarily defensibly, the temperature in Scottish politics during that month and in the weeks running up to the publication of the report, the temperature was quite high, I think it's fair to say. So now that perhaps the temperature has dropped a little bit, what are your reflections now on the conclusion of that committee's work?
Oh God, they actually haven't changed that much, my reflections on it. I mean, the one thing you didn't say there, Andrew, was that it was in the run-up to an election.
Yes, of course.
And I think that showed.
Yes.
Because the temperature was ridiculous. And some of the stuff that was going on, I'm still absolutely disgusted by the leaks that quite clearly went on.
Yes.
I'm disgusted at some of the talking to the press, appearing on TV and things with opinions of some. Social media was an absolute nightmare. All in all, these are things that happened, and I'm not that bothered about them, though I would hope that the current presiding officer of the Parliament and others are looking at codes of conduct with a view to bringing them up to date, because they do not do anything to help with social media, etc. So I hope that's ongoing. I think beyond that, beyond the politics and the grandstanding, what was issued was quite a good report in terms of what went wrong within the UK civil service at the time. And despite the rhetoric, you know, Nicola Sturgeon neither has the time nor the HR experience to be running the entire Scottish Government HR service.
Yes.
So it is the role of the civil service, the UK civil service up there, and then the Scottish Government's UK civil servants to run this properly. And I was quite appalled by some of the stuff that was uncovered, because right at the centre of it were two young women who I believe had been badly served by their employers. Very badly served.
Yes.
Now, I was quite disturbed to read just this week in the press that the report that was supposed to go back to the Scottish Parliament from the Scottish Government saying how that was being improved is delayed. I can understand why it's delayed with Omicron, but I'm still a bit disappointed. And I hope, beyond hope, and I'll never know because I'm not there anymore, I hope that the young women involved have been properly dealt with and kept up to date as to why these things are delayed, and given the respect that they're due and the treatment that they're due from their employer. And now, I know there's a new permanent secretary starting in January, I think. Now, if this report hasn't come out yet, I would hope that's one of the very first things that he will deal with.
Yes.
I don't know what he's like, I've got no idea. Because whilst the Permanent Secretary is there to serve the Scottish Government in terms of the First Minister and Ministers and everything else, they also have an absolute obligation to their staff.
Yes, as an employer, absolutely.
And that should be looked at very carefully. And I hope that the trade unions are quite active in all of this as well, because this should never be allowed to happen again.
Yes,
The
yes.
treatment of these employees by their employer was completely out of order.
Absolutely, Linda. Thank you. What we should do now, I think we should rush forward from March into April, as the nights then were fair drawing out, and in terms of our conversation this evening about COVID, we know that on the 14th of April. That was the first day since the beginning of the pandemic that COVID was not the leading cause of death in the UK. So it feels like something was changing at that point. But more generally, in terms of COVID, it was in the third week in April that the reporting of the way in which PPE and other contracts had been distributed to friends and family of Conservative ministers and donors using a VIP lane that was then denied, but for which there was plenty of evidence. It was at that point that these contracts started to feature more regularly in the news reporting, and that people began to become aware of what was going on and the manner in which the emergency had been responded to in financial terms by a number of businesses which were either, I've seen them this morning being described as box fresh, but businesses that had no track record in providing PPE or services in connection with the health service, who were then being awarded significant contracts. And as we now know, in some circumstances, were being commissioned to provide PPE, which was never fit for purpose. So whilst we don't yet have the inquiries into the government, both the Westminster and Holyrood government's handling of the pandemic, albeit that the chairs of those two inquiries have been appointed. And I'm particularly in Scotland. I'm looking forward to Izzy Poole chairing that inquiry. I know from first-hand experience the style with which she will guide that inquiry. But what's your reflection now as to were you surprised that the Westminster government responded to the pandemic in the manner that they did in handing out these contracts this way? And do you think that's having any effect on the way in which people are regarding the Westminster government?
Well, I think surprised. No, I wasn't that surprised. The Tories. That's maybe a terrible thing to say. Or the Tories, let me qualify that. They are Tories of a particular type. Because
yes.
I have great respect for some Conservative politicians who I have met over the years and worked with over the years. They seem to be few and far between now in prominent positions.
Yes.
That's a problem. So the bunch that are heading it up now, no, I wasn't that surprised. I was perhaps surprised at how transparent they were in the wrongdoing.
In plain sight.
Yes, and I remember thinking to myself, are they really so arrogant that they don't give a toss? They just look after their own. Or are they really so wrapped up in their own establishment, whether it be politics, business, press and all that they just think that's the way you behave?
Yep.
And don't think anything of it. But what I would say about it, and I'm pretty sure that when that report comes out, it'll be quite horrendous. But that was the first, I think, that the public really started to see what this government is like.
Yes.
And it's been one thing after another since then. It's just like rolled out, the corruption, the arrogance, the complacency, the incompetence, the complete self-centeredness of a certain set of people in power.
Yes.
And I think that's when people started to see what they were like. And for the man at the top, Boris Johnson, gone was the bumbling, quite affable fool, who actually was a great intellect underneath, which is what we were all supposed to believe.
Yes.
And people really started to see him for what he was a complete incompetent with no moral compass.
Yep.
So that was the start of that, and there's more to come, I'm pretty sure.
Well, I think you're absolutely right. The other aspect that we see, the other important news story internationally in April this year, really was on the 20th of April. We saw that back in the United States of America, we saw the conviction for murder of the policeman Derek Chauvin, the conviction for the murder of George Floyd. Yeah. Now that murder and that prosecution attracted a great deal of attention during the first half of the year. And it manifested itself well, firstly in terms of the completion of the judicial process in the United States, but also in a much wider movement and a much wider respect movement in terms of the position of black citizens in the United States and in the United Kingdom and elsewhere too. The Black Lives Matter movement very quickly took hold and very quickly was able to begin its campaigning and its messaging around the world. Do you think in the months since that conviction, are you detecting any sign of any fundamental shift? We were speaking before about the finding of institutional sexism in the Metropolitan Police, and of course in the context of Black Lives Matter, I'm immediately reminded of the McFarlane report 25 years ago, finding institutional racism in the Metropolitan Police. Do you think, following on from the events of this conviction, that any green shoots at all of any change for the better?
Certainly in the United States of America, I'm not seeing an awful lot. I just feel we've been here before. And even since the murder of George Floyd, there have been other incidents and other police personnel in court, etc.
Yes.
Flip over the Atlantic. Yes, the Met were found guilty of institutional racism. I suspect it's still there. I remember when it all happened before, after the murder of Stephen Lawrence and everything else. And indeed we had it, and let's not say that we're completely innocent of all this stuff too. We had it as well, and it was Strathclyde Police about Surjit Singh Chokar.
Yes,
there was a report about that.
And Shekabio and
we now have Shekabio. I'm not going to make a judgment on what's going to happen about Shekabio because I really don't know, but what I will say, it's an absolute piece of nonsense that it's taken so long.
Yep.
Something far wrong. It's ridiculous. However, so no, I don't think an awful lot has changed. I remember, certainly in the Met, I remember for ourselves up here too, there was all the talk of how we were going to have more officers from ethnic minority backgrounds and do this and do that. I haven't seen much of that at all.
No.
So it's quite disheartening, actually. I think attitudes, certainly in Scotland and I hope in England, as our neighbours, are amongst the general public, I think, are a bit healthier than they ever were. And a recognition, the support for the Black Lives Matter campaign. Yes, it had its detractors, some of which used vile language in that detraction. But I think generally people bought into it. And
yes.
I think that's really important. The stuff that some of the football clubs are doing just now in the anti-racism campaigns is good as well. It's moving slowly, though.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. No, absolutely right. Thanks, Linda. We should perhaps now take the opportunity to roll forward again and into May this year. Now, obviously, at the beginning of May, the political temperature in Scotland that we were talking about a moment ago, it came to a peak with the campaign and then the election on Thursday, the 6th of May, which now obviously that date was important in your life because you were you having served. Since our Parliament was restored, you stood down and qualified for your retirement. So you're now a few months have passed that you may be able to reflect a little bit in terms of the campaign and the outturn at the election. Were any aspects of the campaign or the result a surprise to you?
A disappointment more than a surprise, I think. Well, campaigning was really difficult. Well, it was doubly difficult for me because when I went out to help Colette Stevenson, who I'm glad got elected after I stood down for East Kilbride, The first day I went out with Colette to leaflet, I fell and done my ankle.
You did, I remember.
Skinned my nose and bust my ankle. So I had a cast iron excuse not to go to but it wasn't deliberate. So it was a very strange campaign, though I know that Colette found it quite difficult because she'd been campaigning with me over the years and
Yes.
used to knock on the doors and chat to people, and it was always a very happy time. We all loved campaigning.
Yes.
A really happy time. So she didn't have that. And, you know, for her and the new intake who've got into Holyrood, I've often thought it's quite a shame for them because they're not getting that buzz of being first elected. And also, it was a very strange departure for the likes of myself and my colleagues who stood down. Never get the chance to say cheerio to anyone.
Yes.
So it was all very strange. The result of the election, I would have hoped that we'd got a couple more. When I was saying we, I should say that the SNP had got a couple more. I was glad the Greens did as well as they did.
Yes.
And I'm pleased that there's now an agreement with the SNP and the Greens, a sort of independence coalition. I'm delighted at that. So I think it was a good outcome. The one thing that's really struck me is that I always thought that I would always know everything about the Parliament and about the politics and going on. Do you know, I see people and I think, what party are they in? And I don't, do you know, and it's really been a hard lesson for me because when you're so immersed in politics, party politics and stuff, you have an assumption that people know what's going on.
Yes.
And now I'm thinking, I haven't a clue what's going on. So if I haven't a clue what's going on, you know, I was making assumptions previously that I shouldn't have been making.
if you're not on top of it, what hope the rest of us have? That's absolutely right. That's absolutely right. And thinking of the way in which since this Parliament began resitting in following the election in May, what's your impression of the first few months for these, especially for these new politicians?
Oh yeah, well it's hard. I mean, here they are elected and the Parliament's not as open and accessible as it should be and that everyone wants it to be. They're not being able to open their constituency offices with a big fanfare and welcome the public in. Not being able to have big public meetings and say, here I am. You know, poor Colette, she's not been able to stand up and say, that Fabiani woman's away, you've got me now. We've not even been able to have constituency party meetings other than on Zoom. So and you know, so you've got all these and a big load of new people there for whom it's very difficult. And I just hope that by the time summer comes, the better weather comes, that they're going to have that ability to be out and about, doing street surgeries, meeting people. Because the joy of my work, I mean, I was very grateful for the work I did and very honoured, but the absolute joy of my work was being out and about in the constituency, whether it be the schools, the college, businesses, community groups. I loved it. And I didn't have any of that for the last year, which I found sad. But the new people are not getting any of that for their first year. And that's really difficult.
Yes, it'll be interesting to see how that evolves, as you say, as we get into 2022 and depending on how the pandemic works out. Having touched on at length the events here at the beginning of May, the end of May brings us back, I think, to more international news, and in particular at the instruction of the current self-styled president of Belarus, Mr. Lukashenko, the hijacking of a Ryanair flight and the forcing of that flight to land in Minsk in order that the Lukashenko regime could take into custody somebody who they had identified, a journalist who they wished to target. Now, it strikes me that we've been talking this week actually on Scotland at 7 about the completion of the trial in Amsterdam, or in absence of a number of Russian and Ukrainian citizens who are implicated in the bringing down of the Malaysian Air Flight MH17 over Ukraine. And it struck me that in the context of the hijacking by Lukashenko, that the passengers on that aircraft largely were citizens, air travel passengers going about their daily lives, and they suddenly find themselves at the sharp end of a fighter aircraft, forcing them to land in the wrong country. So where do you think we are, especially in Europe, with regard to the apparent challenges of travelling by air across our continent at the moment?
Aye, it was an absolute shocker, that. But it did take me back to when I was fairly young, when there was a spate of this some decades ago. And I think that the one that gets the most publicity was the one in Uganda, I think it was the Israeli Air Force.
Yes, at Entebbe.
Entebbe, that was it, yes. But there was a spate of hijackings all around that time. So I think there was a real concern when, as you say, the self-styled president of Belarus did this, that this would start another spate of such things. It doesn't appear to have so far, but then air travel has been very restricted because of COVID and everything else. But again, what's the base of all this is what we talked about right at the start of this discussion, Andrew, which is governments becoming a bit more authoritarian in many parts of the world.
Yes.
And they seem to be getting away with stuff. And, you know, again, what I said about United Nations, they do have limits within which they can work. But that there has to be some kind of global and discussions, and it will be going on, well, I hope it's going on, among very many people about how the world can better make sure that people are protected.
Yes.
I mean, the idea of a journalist, or indeed anyone fleeing a monstrous regime that's after them, or living quite happily somewhere else in the world, but there's an old rankle from somebody that felt you did them down many years ago, who has the power
Yes.
to get a jet to land somewhere else and take you off it. It's absolutely horrifying.
Absolutely. And I'm sure we will learn more with regard to those events. I certainly know that I think it's pretty clear that Michael O'Leary, who was the responsible for the aircraft, has some fairly strong views on the matter, as you would expect.
Well, he has fairly strong views and everything, that Ian, doesn't he?
He does. He certainly does. But what we should do is we should, for the final segment of our review of the first half of 2021, we should arrive in the warmer and longer nights in June, and we know that in June the first story we spoke about this evening evolved again and moved on as the second, the Delta variant, became the dominant variant in COVID infections in Scotland, and that's a progression that we've continued to see. However, with regard to the government's response to COVID, in the middle of June, we saw. We became aware as a result of reporting of the diversion of quite a significant amount of money by the direction of Michael Gove and money which was intended to be used for public health messaging was diverted into his union unit and was more than £500,000 was being used for polling with regard to what people's attitudes in Scotland were to the UK Union. So in terms of the way in which the Westminster government and ministers have continued to respond on the political side of the COVID crisis, what's your were you surprised by this news, and what's your reflection of the way in which it seems that Mr. Gove's muscular unionism is freely spending cash that's meant to be helping in the pandemic?
Well, no, again, nothing that lot does surprises me, Andrew. I'll tell you what, Michael Gove's been awfully quiet lately.
Yes, he has.
Keeping his head down, isn't he?
Yes, he has.
Interesting. We shall see. Well, you know, the Westminster government has for some time been subverting things away from the devolved administrations. This was blatant, absolutely blatant. But other things they've been doing, you know, in terms of the money they're given to councils to do some of the... And that's Gove's department as well, levelling up.
It is.
So they've been doing it. I'll tell you what upsets me about it more than anything is that you have Scottish politicians complicit with it.
Yes, yes, yes.
You know, they all stand up on their hind legs, even the Tories, and say they believe in devolution and, you know, Nicola's government's got to do this, that and the next thing because that's devolution. Meanwhile, they are just trying to work away at the foundations
Yes.
of our devolution settlement and
Yep.
have it all crumble down. And I mean, some of these new Tories that are there now, and I don't know many of them, I'm just seeing bits and hearing from others, seem like a right bunch of horrors in that regard. And then there's the ones that are at Westminster who lickspittle is the nicest thing I can say about them. But you've also got the Labour Party in Scotland doing this nonsense.
Yep. Yes.
You know, not coming out and saying this is outrageous, you shouldn't be doing this. And I find that the hardest thing of all to deal with. The Lib Dems I sort of get because they just, everybody's pals, you know. But Labour, and I think, was it Michael Mara who actually put out all this stuff lately about, you know, everyone in Scotland should vote Labour to get rid of the Tories. Well, I'll tell you what, Michael and all your cronies, we can get rid of the Tories quite easily if that's what you're about, by having an independent Scotland. But you know what? That democratic independent Scotland might vote for the Tories. I don't know. But it'll be the right if they so choose.
Yep. Yep.
And to hold yourself up as Democrats, to bow down and let the Tories get away with what they're getting away with without saying a thing because your self-interest comes first. Bang out of order, and you should have a good look at yourself. And I'm going to stop talking now because I'm getting in my soapbox and I won't be quiet.
No, I was going to give you another soapbox, if you
Oh,
will, because it certainly struck me that with regard to these funds that Mr. Gove diverted, of course, it's not a surprise that they were diverted to his friends. The agency that was hired was called Public First, and they were the long-standing acquaintances and associates of Mr. Gove.
Aye.
So again, no particular surprise in terms of that approach. But what we'll also do, the other aspect that we saw during June, so that by this stage in the year we're in the run-up to the Euros, which started in early July. If that helps people to try and track this back in their minds, but by the middle of June, and certainly by the end of June, we were in the midst of the latest of the Brexit bonuses that were unfolding at that time, and we were aware by this point that there was a crisis with regard to the lack of HGV drivers, in particular a lack of petrol tanker drivers. And this story dominated the headlines for several weeks. Now, I think it's fair to say that story we're not hearing very much about it at all. But in terms of from the Brexit perspective, do you think that that story began to suggest to people that they might have to recognise and understand what the actual implications of Brexit are actually going to be?
A wee bit. I think a wee bit. And then Boris charged in and saved Christmas. I think people started to see it a wee bit there. But they still don't see the full extent. It's hitting so many different aspects of life. And under the cover of COVID as well.
Yes.
That has made that much lower down the agenda. I think people started to see it a wee bit then, but other things have come along and people have forgotten. When we will really see it is when COVID's over.
Yes.
And I think I've said it before on here. When people start to want to do normal holidays again and things, have big long queues to stand in, visas to get.
Yep.
You know, when your daughter or your son can't go and do the 6 months work that they've always done in the Canary Islands because they're only allowed 90 days.
Yes. Yep.
That's when people will really start to see it hitting home. There's also, you know, at the moment, there's a big delay in things that come, you know, whether it be building materials, even house decorating materials. I've found that recently.
Yes.
There's a delay. Everybody's putting it down to COVID because that's the thing that's foremost in our minds. But it's not just that.
Yes.
So, no, there's a lot more to come. And there'll be other changes come next year as well that will come into
Yes,
force.
we're only a couple of weeks away from the next
Yes.
set of restrictions,
Yes.
And also I think it's fair to say that we've seen a fairly consistent approach from the Westminster government in terms of its mishandling of negotiations and discussions, and the levels of frustration that we see with European leaders with the apparent almost impossibility of doing
but
business
it's this
with Johnson.
jingoism that they keep promoting, and it's not just the current Tories; it's the press as well down south. The Brit jingoism I just find appalling. Like, it's always the French. It's never the fault of them. It's how dare these pesky foreigners speak to us like that. Well, you deserve it. You deserve worse.
Absolutely.
I don't know, and you should have seen it coming. For goodness sake.
Well, absolutely. Well, we should have seen the 6 months coming that we've dealt with, and we've had a great discussion about this evening, January through to June 2021. And so, having reached the end of June, that's our final item for this evening. We will make another programme, a second programme, which will cover the second half of the year, in order that we complete the calendar, and we'll broadcast that shortly as well. But as that was our final item this evening, what I will say, and I say at the end of each programme, is that in making these programmes, Broadcasting Scotland relies on the financial support of viewers and others who value our distinctive approach to news, culture and current affairs. If you would like to support us financially, and we really need that support in order that we can continue to provide an independent Scottish perspective on news and culture, then please consider subscribing or donating to Broadcasting Scotland, and the link to do that you can see on the screen just now. There are other ways in which you can contribute to our work. If you would like to volunteer to work with Broadcasting Scotland, either behind the scenes or in front of the cameras or in any other way that helps to promote the station, then please visit us online at our website, which is www.broadcastingscotland.scot, and please send us a message there. Meanwhile, many thanks to everyone for joining us on Scotland at 7 this evening. And in particular, a tremendous thanks to Linda Fabiani for joining us and for sharing her reflections on what has been a tumultuous first half to a year with lots of events. Linda, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, and have a good Christmas, everyone.
Absolutely. And so that's the way it is at very nearly Scotland at 8. I would like to say that, as Linda has just done, I hope that you and yours enjoy a peaceful Christmas wherever you are and however you're celebrating it. And whilst you are celebrating Christmas, please keep warm and keep well. Bye-bye.